Well, I've talked a lot about canon and continuity in other videos, and lots of others have talked about this in other videos, and much more eloquently than I have and can. But I do want to say something about. Um, I think that one of the differences between what it is the EU is trying to do in terms of canon and continuity and what it is that Disney's trying to do, and how it is that what Disney's trying to do is not only significantly different, but it's considerably more fragile. And actually, the reason I want to talk about this is not to sort of retread the same arguments about whether the EU is canon or not, or whether there were lots of contradictions or not. I don't want to get into that. Again, if Disney canon fans don't believe us by now, they're never going to believe us. Instead, what I'm interested in doing is, in some sense, answering some questions that I get on a pretty regular basis, which is that, you know, will Disney ever reboot its own canon? And I've said this for the last couple of years, and I think the answer is absolutely. I think it's inevitable, and I think it'll happen sooner than later. And it's dawned on me recently that I think a big reason why this is going to happen, I think in addition to others, is the fact that the way in which it's going about this canon continuity business is so fragile. All the creative freedom they purported they needed in 2014 to tell a new story, which is why they had to wipe away the old canon, even though they basically pull from it as much as they want. But all that creative freedom they purported they needed, all that sort of space they felt they had to have, is space that they are rapidly already consuming, right? And it's a physics problem. You can't have the same sort of objects occupying the same space at once. The problem is that they have already so unbelievably oversaturated various eras now in their new Star Wars timeline. I mean, everything they've put out is Rebellion era, right? Which again is ironic, because one of the complaints that so many Disney canon fans have about the EU is how crowded it was, in particular the Rebellion era. But Star Wars has done exactly the same thing. But one of the things that made the EU's canon and continuity unique was not just the fact that it was unprecedented and was so vast and expansive. I mean, relative to any other pop cultural franchise in history, Star Wars was just so massively interconnected and so massively coherent in this grand 37 plus year saga that was unfolding, right? But I think unfolding is kind of the key, and I feel like it would be very, I think, unrealistic to ever assume that when George Lucas, first got Star Wars rolling in the mid to late 70s, that he had this idea of an EU that would span, 4 decades. I think, though, that as the movies started to come out and the early Han Solo and Lando books came out, and then later with West End Games, and then with Bantam and so on and so forth, and then later into Del Rey, and later into so many other products that the EU has given us, I think that there was a very conscious attempt to keep these things stuck together, right? But there wasn't necessarily a plan in 1977 to say, yes, by 2005, I want a book about Mace Windu called, Shatterpoint or something, right? No, this was kind of an unfolding. And as it unfolded, there was sort of a broad guiding principle, kind of an ethic about let's do what we can to keep this stuff together and interconnected, because it is a big universe that we can let sort of multiple sort of voices help shine light on, right? And that's how the EU grew. And it grew because of an ethic around, canon and continuity and coherence for storyline interconnectedness. But it was something that was really sort of organic, right? And I think that's what gave it such value, was that, when Kevin J. Anderson's writing Jedi Academy trilogy, and he's got, the West End game stuff to draw on, and then the Zahn stuff to draw on, well, he wants to, because this isn't just some one-off project for him. This isn't just something with the Star Wars logo stamped on its cover. This is part of an unfolding, expanded universe. It's expanding, right? This is the point, and it's growing organically. And we can look back at it now and sort of say, well, isn't it great that, it almost looks as if there was a plan. I mean, again, contrary to what the EU haters say, it really is that tightly connected. But again, there was kind of at the very, very beginning, kind of a neat organic way in which this was coming about. And here is obviously how this is so different from the Star Wars canon. They've said, look, EU folks, you love the canon continuity, or at least purport to, again, from their point of view, they don't think we had it. They don't think it was canon. They don't think it was coherent and interconnected. Of course it was, right? But they say, okay, you say that about your EU. Well, if you say that and you liked it because of that, you're going to love the Star Wars EU, because it's It's just connected from the start. We've laid it out in a memo. We've told you 2014 going forward after April, everything we pump out is going to be on the same canonical order and it's going to be interconnected. Okay, fine, great, right? Again, they misunderstand what we loved about the EU. It wasn't just that it was connected. That's what made it extra special. We loved it because we love Star Wars and we love the story that was being told, right? They, in other words, were able to organically, and this is the miracle, they were able to organically tell an unfolding, expanding story that was interconnected over 37 years, that was really compelling, that was quality, that expanded beyond just the Skywalker family soap opera, right? And not only gave us more stories about the next generation of the Skywalkers and Solos, but things from tens of thousands of years before the movies. They told and created a world and allowed multiple voices to continue to tell this amazing unfolding story. Disney, on the other hand, has said, we don't want multiple voices. We want one voice. It's our voice. And we're going to have a story group sort of basically like lay this all out. And everything we push out by virtue of the fact that we own this intellectual property is going to be in the same order. And here is where their canon and their ethic around continuity is so fragile. In the way that the EU had a very dynamic way of very helpfully sort of like retconning things when it needed to, right? Okay, great. So we think that Boba Fett's real identity is Jasper Maril. We find out later in Attack of the Clones that that's actually not the case, that he's the sort of the clone son of Jango Fett. Okay, great. It doesn't mean then that everything's broken. It doesn't mean that there are contradictions. It means that what the EU is able to do is to now sort of incorporate some new fact that we didn't otherwise know at the time about Jasper Maril, and to sort of understand that, okay, that was an identity that he had taken, Boba Fett, in order to sort of do, okay? So in other words, there was a constantly dynamically sort of, again, part of the organic and evolving, expanding sort of nature of the EU, right? That was very healthy and allowed the system to continue to grow, right? It's kind of like the universe. The universe is, we now know from physics, is sort of like ever expanding, right? Because if it wasn't, well, then if we like, I don't know, I mean, if we went out there and started exploring, we get to the edge of space and what? Fall outside it, right? But the universe is ever expanding, right? Just like the EU, it could continue to grow. We could learn more about Boba Fett, right? Not in ways that broke the system, but in ways that disallowed the system to grow in new sorts of areas, right? In new directions, allowed it to expand even further. If something like this were to happen in the Star Wars canon, the universe would break. It's physics, right? The same object can't occupy the same space at the same time. If a movie now says something about a character that is not true in the books, well, Disney could maybe come out and say, oh, no, we meant this all along. But they've really created a pretty dangerous, fragile sort of scenario for their fans, right? And for their own ability to tell the stories that they purported they needed the freedom to tell in the first place, right? If a year from now in a new movie we find out something radically different about some new character they created in The Force Awakens or something, what's a fan to think? They're going to be confused because Star Wars has told them, Disney has told them that everything about this character is canonical by design, right? The brain trust, the story group, they've laid this out. They've got the vision. It's not expanding. They're just slowly doling it out as they sort of see fit, right? It's a completely different mentality. They've sort of centrally planned the saga and the adventure, right? Whereas the EU is able to, again, dynamically allow the stuff to sort of be incorporated and healthfully and dynamically and helpfully sort of retconned in ways that sort of allowed this universe to grow. Disney, on the other hand, has created something that it's going to choke. There's only so many things they can say. There's only so many adventures these characters can have. There's only so many things that they're going to be able to sort of like later introduce in order to sort of like deepen certain characters, right? They could never have a Boba Fett, Jasper Maril sort of scenario because the fans would walk away because they've been sold on this idea that it's all out there. Right? Everything they see is purported to be the truth about the Star Wars universe, right? This is very dangerous for the new Disney canon. And I don't think they realize it, but every time they tell us how great it is because it's all canonical and it's all continuity and it's all connected, they don't realize that they've basically written their own death sentence. And this is why I've said for the last couple of years that it's probably within the space of 10 years, we're probably going to see something like, in effect, a full reboot of the Disney canon. But just to offer some quick ideas on how that's going to happen, and I might do a whole separate video on this later, I don't think that what we're going to experience in 10 years is something like Disney writing a memo saying, oh, you know what? Everything we've been producing, it's now an alternate timeline. And we've got yet another timeline. We've got EU, we've got the Disney canon 2014, and now we've got the Disney canon circa 2024 or something like that. What I think is much more likely to happen is that slowly over time, because there is no dynamic sort of pressure release valve on the Disney canon and on that universe, I think we're going to start to see various aspects of it start to slowly be, if not decanonized within the Disney universe, maybe slowly written about in ways that start to negate other aspects of the Disney canon and sort of create workarounds, right? So that any apparent contradictions, if not sort of resolved, or just sort of like swept under the carpet, right? And here's what I actually think is going to probably happen first. I think we're going to start to see, whether it's in the movies or the books or the comics. Again, not that I follow this stuff, but I predict this happening. And I'd be interested for those of you who are into this stuff, who maybe see this video years from now to sort of tell me if this is right or wrong. But what we're going to start to slowly see are that the prequels are probably going to be slowly ignored, if not outright contradicted, right? To the point that they might either formally say altogether that the prequels are no longer canon, or they might say something like, again, sure, like, we've said this thing about Naboo, but what you heard about from Phantom Menace was just sort of like a corruption of like holocron files or something like that, right? No, this is really sort of the way Naboo is supposed to be sort of thought of. And again, they'll probably be able to get away with that for a little while until fans start to rebel and say, I thought you told me everything was canon. How can you keep sort of going back, right? Again, they're going to start laying multiple sorts of ideas about the same thing on top of one another in the timeline. And again, it's a physics problem. It won't hold. That system's going to break. To the point that, again, I think over time they're going to eventually have to say, you know what, the whole system's broken. That's why we're starting from scratch. But again, I think the prequels are going to be affected first. And then I sort of feel like, to the extent that Disney is pumping out a movie each year now, I think they're going to both contribute to and be a victim of the sort of the cinematic universe superhero comic book movie boom and bust. I mean, at some point, it's not going to be feasible that all the people Disney brought out, sort of brand new to the franchise to watch The Force Awakens and Rogue One, are going to be around to sort of be constantly putting down their $10 each year for the next superhero movie, in addition to Star Wars movies, in addition to everything else that's coming out, right? So those markets are going to start to fade. It's going to put some sort of, mild internal pressure on that story group to start doing things differently, to sort of, tell different stories, to sort of capture new audiences. And although this won't mean that it's going to necessarily immediately lead to a rebooting, it's certainly going to affect the quality, because that story group's going to be forced to do things to the movies and the books and the comics that maybe don't make a lot of sense, maybe don't necessarily adhere to the internal logic of the Disney canon timeline, right? But for the interest of butts and seats and ticket sales, they're going to have to do things that don't match up. And again, fans are going to say, but I thought everything you told me about this character or this idea or this storyline was canon. How can it be changing now? Well, it's changing to put butts in seats, right? But that's not going to be a satisfactory answer. And it's certainly not an answer that that's going to make anyone feel any better about the Disney canon and whether or not it's doing canon and continuity better than the old EU could, right? And then I think probably more realistically, probably after the prequels and probably after some of the story group starts to sort of tweak elements of the movies and stuff like that, I think the books and the comics in particular, the comics are going to have to reboot. I mean, if you take them as a medium by itself, comics reboot every couple of years, usually about every 3 or 5 years. Marvel and DC do it, or Marvel and DC do it all the time. They don't get about 20, 50 issues in before Marvel then creates Secret Wars again, right? And then DC does Rebirth, and the list goes on and on and on. The New 52, Flashpoint, Crisis. I mean, like the DC Comics alone is rebooting every 5 years. I can't keep up anymore, right? And I think ultimately Star Wars comics, the Marvel Star Wars comics are going to probably do the same thing. There's going to be points at which they're going to say, this comic line, it's no longer canon. Oh, this new comic line, it's more of an infinity story, right? So eventually, that canon, that Disney Star Wars timeline, this is my prediction, it's going to start to do things to alienate the prequels. It's going to start to do things to alienate its own fans through the various movies. It's going to start doing things that are going to be retconning, but not in ways that the canon is able to sort of dynamically adjust to. The comics are probably going to start, moving along alternate timelines within the Disney canon. And I think finally it's going to come to the point where it's no longer canon altogether. And that's the point at which the EU has a way back in. That's when we can say, if you, Disney, have multiple timelines, surely you can allow the EU to be another timeline as well. Well, that's just some thoughts for now. Would love your thoughts on this, whether this makes any sense, and we'll see in a couple of years if this pans out. All right, adios, guys.